Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Giovanna Di Martino, and I am the academic advisor for UCL's classical play, which this year will be very excitingly Euripides Bacchae. So there's lots of, or there will be actually lots of resources about UCL as introductory resources about UCL's classical play. We've got at the moment David Bullen's program note on which is kind of introductory to the themes of the play that the play brings up. This is a rather sort of unique and interesting play that we've picked. And there's an interview with Isabel Ruffle, which is about Bacchae being a trans play. And I have invited here to talk with me about Dionysus two colleagues of mine at UCL, Fiachra Góráin, who is associate professor of classics at UCL, and one of his main interests is, I believe, Dionysus, and Maddalena Italia, who's research fellow at UCL and whose main research is on Sanskrit and more specifically erotic literature within Sanskrit literature. So I think my first main question is, who is Dionysus? Who is this god who kind of opens the play with "I have come to Thebes" and is very much present in the whole of Euripides' Bacchae, and is claiming very strongly to be a god and to be recognized as such?
Well, a lot of the myths about Dionysus present him as arriving. He's often referred to as an epiphanic god because he turns up from somewhere else. And in Euripides' Bacchae, he's turned up at Thebes, having spread his religion in Asia, and he has a chorus of Eastern Maenads in tow. For a very long time, scholars thought that this meant that Dionysus was a relatively new god in the Greek pantheon, that all of these myths of arrival that we have in the Bacchae, that we have in the Homeric hymn, that we have in Ovid, that we have in other sources, was an indication that he was a newcomer and that this arrival was in some way a kind of a historical reminiscence of the god's addition to the pantheon. And in 1952, when the Linear B tablets were deciphered, it transpired that Dionysus's name was mentioned in clay tablets that survived from the palace culture from the middle of the second millennium BCE. In ritual contexts, in one case alongside Zeus, so tablets from Pylos in southern Greece and tablets from Chania in Crete. And this was a sort of a revolution in Dionysian studies because then it transpired that Dionysus actually was very, very ancient indeed, and that he wasn't a new arrival. So the myth of arrival then is reinterpreted as a structural feature of Dionysian myth and of the sort of character of Dionysus, that it is an aspect of his power that he can manifest suddenly. Beyond that, Dionysus is most fundamentally a god of fertility and vegetation. And Plutarch tells us, for example, in his dialogue on Isis and Osiris, that Dionysus is the god or the principle of liquid life. And he quotes a line of Pindar to substantiate that. So he's a nature god, and that is how he comes to be associated with the vine, and with wine and with fertility. And there are a lot of myths that connect Dionysus with the invention of wine, from the making of wine from grapes, and not only with the making of the product, but with the civilized consumption of the product involving mixing it with water. And sometimes he's a counterpart to the goddess Demeter or the Roman Ceres, in the sense that she's the goddess of grain, corn, agriculture, and the dry principle, if you like, of food, and he's the god of liquid life. He's also god of theatre. So one of the things that's special about Euripides' Bacchae is that it contains this play within a play where Pentheus gets dressed up. And a lot of scholars, including people like Richard Seaford and Charles Siegel, have put a certain amount of emphasis on the idea of Dionysus as god of metatheatre, god of a play that in some sense acts as a kind of a foundation myth for the Athenian theatre festival. He's also a god of the afterlife. We have some vases in southern Italy where he's seen in Hades. And one of the gods of the Eleusinian mysteries was Iacchus, which is one of the cult titles of Dionysus. And Dionysus was one of the gods and heroes who went down into the underworld, in his case, to retrieve his mother Semele, and to elevate her to the status of divinity. So the afterlife is part of his portfolio, if you like, and he's quite like Jesus in some ways, in that Nonnus, the late antique epic poet, who's one of our great sources for Dionysian myth, talks about the miracle of changing water into wine. And there are various touches, particularly in St. John's Gospel, where Jesus, for example, says that he is the true vine, and this is understood by some to be a kind of a Dionysian motif.
Yes, my other question is more kind of refer to your own research and what you've, well, I mean, not that this wasn't, but it's more kind of getting into Dionysus in Rome and what kinds of interactions occurred between Greek and Italian culture in early colonized Italy.
Well, the more work archaeologists do in Italy, especially central and southern Italy, the further back they tend to date and anchor contact with the Greek world. And we know from archaeological sources, but we also have historiographic narratives from Herodotus and others, that when faced with famine, starvation, failing harvests, challenges like earthquakes or volcanoes, that people who needed to feed themselves left parts of the Greek world and generally traveled east and west across the ancient Mediterranean. So they settled on the coast of Turkey, and we have obviously a lot of Greek-speaking communities, Herodotus himself being from Halicarnassus, and they went west. So we have the phenomenon of the Western Greeks, meaning Sicily, southern Italy. So much so that southern Italy was known as Magna Graecia, Great Greece in Latin. And people often speak in terms of two waves of Hellenization on the Italian peninsula. The first wave of Hellenization happened in this early colonial period. Traditionally, they say that Cuma on the Bay of Naples and the island of Pithecusae, Ischia were the first colonies. And we're talking, I think we'd be talking about 1000 BC or possibly earlier. And from this point, we can trace a very heavy flow of traffic of sort of trade goods, vases, grave goods, settlement practices, and so on from the Greek world into southern Italy. So that, if you like, was the first wave of Hellenization. And then the second wave of Hellenization happened hundreds of years later after Rome had conquered Greece. And the conquest of Greece by Rome begins with wars with Macedonia and then the Aetolian Wars and so on. And Horace, when he's writing at the time of Augustus, has this famous line: Greece, once conquered her savage victor and brought the arts to rustic Latium. So that would then be the second Hellenization of Rome that Horace is talking about there. And Dionysus comes with Greek culture, and we can see a lot of imagery of Dionysian cult and the use of the wine, flooding into Rome, or rather into southern Italy before even Rome had established hegemony over the peninsula. Euripides, in his play The Cyclops, refers to Dionysus as Theos en Askoi, or the god in the wineskin. And various essayists and historians of religion have used this phrase to describe the importation, the transmission of Dionysus, coextensive perhaps with the importation of viticulture. Now, there's a very big question as to whether the Italians, before the arrival of Greek culture, had an equivalent wine god. And one of the reasons that we might think they did is that the Etruscan equivalent of Bacchus Dionysus is a god called Fufluns, and that god it's a completely different name. You can't trace any philological relationship on linguistic grounds between Dionysus or Liber or any of these titles and Fufluns. But we do have some Etruscan inscriptions where Fufluns has the epiclesis or the additional name Fufluns Pachies, is indeed, or does indeed sound as though it's cognate with Bacchus. And the question then arises, are we talking in terms of analogy, or are we talking in terms of translation, or some sort of approximation? And nobody really knows the answer to that question. But it's quite likely that there was a fertility god, a nature god, a wine god on the Italian peninsula before the Greek influence that we're talking about during the colonial period and later. And it's quite likely that Dionysus, if you like, became superimposed or asserted himself over the existing local god in terms of things like iconography and possibly also ritual. It's very interesting when you look at the southern Italian vases, you find a distinctive southern Italian, particularly Apulian style of vase painting. And when it comes to talking about, translating gods and the transmission of religious ritual, you often find that they put down roots in the new place with local inflections or with some different, shall we say, behaviors, which could be iconographic or which could be ritual or whatever. And certainly there are some iconographic differences between the Greek Dionysus or the Athenian Dionysus that is very dominant in the 5th century and in the 4th century, and the versions of Dionysus that you find at around the same time and in succeeding centuries in southern Italy. And there's much more that could be said about the differences between the Greek Dionysus in general and the Roman Dionysus. One of the main points that we might make, of course, the Greek picture is really quite dominated by the Athenian evidence, including Euripides' Bacchae. But generally, they made a lot of space for Dionysus. He was incorporated into their civic calendar. You have the greater Dionysia and the lesser Dionysia. And you can read what Robert Parker has to say about those in his book on the religious festivals of the Athenians. Whereas in Rome, we have this contrasting story of the Bacchanalian episode in 186 BC, where the Senate clamps down on the worship of Bacchus. And it's very interesting to observe this contrast between, on the one hand, the Dionysus being embraced by the Athenians, and on the other hand, Dionysus being regulated, to some extent clamped down upon by the Senate in the 2nd century BC. It's not so much that they were opposed to the god Dionysus himself, so much as that they wanted to regulate and to subordinate the worship of the god to the ordinances of the state. And in the main narrative source that we have for that episode, Book 39 of Livy's History, we have there the idea that the Dionysian cult was growing so quickly that it had virtually become a second populace, almost like a state within a state. It also had a structure of priesthoods, female priests, as it happens, that the senators were probably not very happy with. And young men under the age of 18 were being initiated at very high frequency. And no doubt the senators were worried about the potentially corrupting influence of this cult on the youth and wanted any worship of Dionysus to be subsumed within the Roman religious calendar rather than operating under its own auspices. So it's interesting to look at the contrasts between the Greek Dionysus, or the Greek expressions and manifestations of and reactions to Dionysus, and the Roman and Italian ones.
So at the beginning you mentioned nonnus, and that's where I want to start with Maddalena, which is about this tradition in Greek writings which kind of reports that Dionysus had conquered India long before the Macedonians did with Alexander the Great. And my question basically is nonnus is part of this tradition, but what do we know about this tradition?
Well, indeed, the first Greek writing author that comes to mind is also the most recent within this tradition. And so, since you mentioned Nonnus of Panopolis, an Egyptian city who lived in the 5th century CE, and famously composed an extraordinarily long epic poem, the and this epic poem recounts the life of Dionysus, and most interestingly, it recounts the story of his campaign to conquer India, especially between, I believe, books 13 and 40. There are 48 books in total. So what happens here, I'm thinking especially of book 14, the first battle. So we encounter Dionysus with his Bacchic troops that are composed of mostly Maenad satyrs. And they massacre the Indians, the Indian troops. And Dionysus at some point takes pity on the Indians, and what he does is turn the water of a lake into wine. So the Indians try wine for the first time. And this wine was originally water, so the water of the lake. And they become drunk and they fall asleep. The whole epic poem, the Dionysiaca, is full of Bacchic miracles, and it is all contains episodes that detail Dionysus' madness. But what is particularly interesting is again that we have a sprawling account of this war that lasts 7 years. So definitely this is the main source, the main literary source that provides plenty of detail about this long-standing tradition. Well, going back in time, another Greek writing author that we must mention, who mentions the expedition led by Dionysus to India, is Lucian. So Lucian was born in Roman Syria, probably around 125 CE. And I'm mentioning him because he's the author of a little tract, a very short pamphlet almost, titled The Dionysus, which incidentally has been discussed in minute detail and at length by our colleague Firoz Vasunia in a recent article, which I believe appeared last year in 2022, which is titled A God in Translation, Dionysus from Luce to Gandhara. What is interesting about this tract is that here we do not have the narrative expansion and the flourish of Nonnus' epic poem, but instead we just have a very brief description of the reactions of what Lucian imagines were the reactions of the Indians when Dionysus arrived with his troops of, again, Maenads and Satyrs, and in particular the reactions of the Indians in hearing that this god is traveling with crazy women. And so what they do, what the locals do, is to underestimate the power of the god and of his armies. And so eventually Dionysus, who here is a kind of a mirror image, well, or rather an image of Lucian himself. So Lucian sees himself as Dionysus, as the underdog, the one who's perceived as being of lesser importance and not particularly effective, not particularly threatening, because he's surrounded by these crazy women. And what happens to the Indians is that they are beaten, they are defeated precisely by this crazy seeming god surrounded by seemingly harmless, defenseless women. And so Lucian, who seems to be always discussing very light comedic topics, who's in fact a very worthy and important author. So that's again another interesting angle from which to look at this long-standing tradition. But if we go further back in time, we can see that the historians of recounted the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and here I'm thinking of Arrian, Diodorus, they do mention Dionysus' birth in and or conquest of India, and they go so far as to ascribe these stories about Dionysus' birth in and or conquest of India to Indian sources. And in these stories, again, we have, as Fiachra has mentioned, Dionysus is also described as the bringer of civilization through vine and wine, and also the one who teaches India to dance. So we have wine, or the civilized way of drinking wine and dancing, as markers of culture brought by this god to India. So India is civilized thanks to him. And Well, if we go further back in time, of course, so we have Euripides' Bacchae, and of course that is where essentially we started from, with this idea of Dionysus, who's a god arriving to Greece. So we kind of had the opposite movement. Instead of his campaign to India, here we have Dionysus arriving, his arrival in Greece.
I thought that was a very interesting account, Maddalena, of the various connections between Dionysus and India. And you reminded me in particular of the scene in Arrian's history of the Anabasis of Alexandria, where he's talking about the campaign in India, where they come to Mount Meros. And there are various sources in Greek mythology that talk about Dionysus being born on Mount Meros or associated with Mount Meros. And when Alexander and his troops get there, they come to this ivy-covered mountain and they meet people who claim to be the descendants of Dionysus from the time that Dionysus went there and settled at exactly the time that you're talking about with reference to Nonnus. And it's very difficult not to think here of some of the sources that connect Dionysus with Osiris and indeed with Egyptian religion. And two that come to mind are Herodotus, where in Book 2, when he's talking about Egypt, he connects various Greek divinities with Egyptian counterparts. He talks about Zeus, he talks about Hercules, he talks about Dionysus, and then Plutarch in his dialogue on Isis and Osiris that I mentioned briefly also has an interesting discussion of the equivalence and indeed identity of Dionysus and Osiris. So it's very interesting to think that Dionysus is both quintessentially Greek, but also that he has these Eastern aspects. And he's one of the most Greek gods, as we know from the Linear B tablets, but it's fascinating to contemplate how and to speculate why, the most Greek of gods and one of our oldest living symbols, to use another phrase from Richard Seaford, should so often manifest with these Eastern other aspects, particularly when you think that in the 5th century and onwards, that Greek self-definition was very often a matter of contrast between the East and the West, between the Greek and the Persian, between the self and the other.
Yeah, thank you, Fiachra, for this, and we'll come back. I think we'll come back to this idea of Dionysus being, very Greek, but at the same time, bringing this whole kind of otherness to the Greek world and out of the Greek world. But I want to kind of come back to Rome for a moment, and I want to ask you whether you think there's a difference between the cult to Dionysus and how the story kind of develops and evolves, the myth develops and evolves around Dionysus and Dionysian and the Dionysiac figures and rites and whatever is associated with his cult. If there's a difference between how it was established in Roman Republic and how it changes during the empire. And here, I want to go back to one thing that you said about the Roman Senate trying to chain Dionysus down and Dionysian cults and rites down, something that actually Pentheus also tries to do in Euripides' Bacchae with no, success. But if you could also briefly touch upon this idea that Dionysus is someone who needs to be clamped down in the Roman culture because he might represent something that the Romans don't want to unleash, and if that, how much of that is connected with theatre culture and performance culture?
Well, I think the reference to Pentheus is a very fruitful and insightful entry point, actually, because there are so many myths of Dionysus. I mentioned that there were these myths of Dionysus that represent him as appearing suddenly epiphanically from the east or from nowhere at all to suddenly sort of standing beside you. And when this happens, then there are two possible outcomes, or two possible ways that Dionysus might be greeted. On the one hand, he might be welcomed and embraced and understood and worshipped and validated, or on the other hand, he might be resisted or treated with suspicion or derision. And it's fascinating to see how Euripides' Bacchae represents both of these positions, and that you have the scene with Cadmus and Tiresias, who welcome him in slightly different ways and for slightly different reasons. Tiresias in quite a philosophical way with a priestly outlook, And then Cadmus, who perhaps isn't maybe quite as convinced on a religious or philosophical level as Tiresias is, but who wishes to admit Dionysus on the grounds of political expediency. So, and then Pentheus comes along, and he's very resistant to Dionysus, and he thinks that it's an excuse to be, going off into the woods, into the countryside, and having revelry and having sex outside marriage. And he wants to preserve social order and that kind of thing. And that's just a very interesting kind of background template for the story that Livy tells in Book 39 about the Roman Senate's clampdown on the Dionysian cult, because the way in which Livy and the characters in Livy's narrative describe the Dionysian cult is very much singing off the same hymn sheet as Pentheus. That is to say, it is a rhetoric of suspicion and resistance and immorality and decline and pernicious foreign influence and subversion of Roman values. And all of these motifs that really are quite common and patterned and recurring in a lot of contexts where Rome, where we have the Roman narrative of immorality and decline. The interesting thing is that despite the clampdown in 186 BCE, we continue to have references to Dionysian cult. And this raises the question whether the regulation and suppression of Dionysus was honored more in the breach than in the observance. Of course, we don't have a complete data set, shall we say, of evidence of who exactly was worshipping which god when. It's not as though the worship of Dionysus was outlawed, simply it was regulated and permission needed to be obtained. But another very interesting thing happens, which is that as Rome has increased contact with the Hellenistic kingdoms, then we get in the late Republic, really from the time of Marius onwards, the rise of the charismatic figure, of the charismatic general, who is politically and militarily very charismatic. And we begin to see analogies or correspondences between these figures and Alexander, or in some cases, these figures and Dionysus. So, for example, Pompey the Great modeled himself greatly on the figure of Alexander, down to his iconography, down to his little quiff of hair, his hairstyle, like Alexander's flowing mane. And from Marius onwards, we have occasional references that suggest either that Roman generals modeled themselves on Dionysus or on the archetypal mythical Indian triumph of Dionysus, or that other people did that for them. So, for example, Pliny the Elder tells us that Marius, the general, drank from a cantharus in imitation of Dionysus. And it has been suggested that Pompey's use of elephants in his triumph was in imitation of Dionysus. We're told by Servius, late anti-commentator on Virgil, that Julius Caesar reintroduced the rites of Dionysus in Rome. Not everybody believes that he did that historically, but the attestation is still very interesting. And then perhaps most famously, Mark Antony presented himself as Dionysus, as a new Dionysus. And in doing so, Mark Antony was plugging into the religious politics of the Ptolemaic kingdom, which was the family, the dynasty that ruled Egypt. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals, and when Alexander's generals carved up the empire that Alexander had won between them, Ptolemy I, Soter, obtained dominion over Egypt, and Cleopatra was the 13th Ptolemy. So there was Ptolemy the 12th Auletes and Ptolemy Cleopatra was his daughter, so she was, if you like, the 13th in line of descent from Alexander's general. And when Mark Antony was cavorting with Cleopatra, there I've just used the word cavorting, sort of slipping into the Roman rhetoric of disapproval. But when Antony and Cleopatra were a couple, it was expedient to Antony to present himself as a Dionysian figure in the East. And there's an awful lot of this in Plutarch's Life of Antony, where Plutarch talks about Antony coming into Ephesus, for example, in the 40s BC, in the late 40s BC, dressed as Dionysus, and that Antony and Cleopatra dressed as Dionysus and Selene or Aphrodite. We have an inscription saying that he did the same thing in Athens, and various other sources that record this, but Plutarch is certainly the richest And it's very interesting to observe how this may have been a good thing for Antony to do while he was in the East. But as far as news of him doing this reaching Rome is concerned, the plan definitely backfired. And one of our best pieces of information or testimony on this is the late historian Cassius Dio, where Cassius Dio is writing about the Battle of Actium and about the Battle of Actium being, of course, the naval battle between the forces of Octavian and Agrippa and Rome on the one hand, and Antony, Cleopatra, and their allies on the other. And in the speech of exhortation to his men before the Battle of Actium, Octavian criticizes Antony for his Dionysian persona, for, as it were, going native in Eastern dress and being un-Roman and having this un-Roman wife, and he mentioned specifically behaving like Dionysus. So it's really fascinating how, in Dio's view, Octavian can sort of activate this almost Pentheus-like attitude, this negative censorious view of the Dionysian that never really goes away in the Roman sources.
That's really interesting, thank you. And I want to ask another question to you, Maddalena, which is about sort of scholarship that has often identified other or similar gods, similar to Dionysus in Indian culture, and how much of that is true.
I believe that you are thinking of the parallels that have been drawn between, especially modern times, between the Greek god Dionysus and the Hindu god Shiva, the destroyer, or the erotic ascetic, as the contemporary Indologist Wendy Doniger has dubbed him. I must stress, as a preliminary observation, that there aren't Indian sources that mention Dionysus, let alone his birth in or triumph over India. Comparisons of Dionysus with the erotic ascetic, the destroyer, Shiva, are indeed a phenomenon of the modern era. However, as Wendy Doniger herself reminds us, Strabo in his geography, citing Megasthenes Indica, refers to the god in the mountains, and that would be Shiva, so the Indian god in the mountains, as Dionysus. So there is a connection, an implicit comparison that is being made there. But I think that for contemporary intellectuals, the first reference to this pairing between Dionysus and Shiva that will come to mind is probably the very famous and influential essay by the 20th century French historian Alain Danielou. The essay that I'm referring to is titled Shiva and Dionysus, the Religion of Nature and of Eros, from Prehistory to the Future, which I think has been translated into English, often the title, as Gods of Love and Ecstasy. This essay was first published in 1979. It was revised in 1991. So the standard comparisons between Shiva and Dionysus, as I said, very modern ones, inevitably end up quoting as points of correspondence, and here I'm also referring to Wendy Doniger's own essay titled again Shiva and Dionysus. So the points of correspondence are again wine, so intoxication, let's say, ecstasy, so that both gods experience and allow their worshippers to experience in turn. The bull, so as an animal that is particularly representative of the god, connected with the god, or into which the god seems to metamorphose, or that carries the god. Then snakes, the association with snakes, that is characteristic not only of Dionysus, but of the god Shiva. Then, well, the location of the mountains, and so this particular landscape. I have just mentioned that Shiva was identified as the god of the mountains. Nocturnal rites, not only for Dionysus, but also for Shiva, if we're thinking of, for example, tantric rites, for example, happen at night, and the use of drums and dancing. So Shiva as the god of this cosmic dance, and of course we have talked at length about the connection between Dionysus and dancing, ecstatic dancing. There is a connection also in terms of this insistence on the presence of frenzied women, the women who take part in these rites, in these rituals. Well, Fiachra has mentioned the topic of fertility, and well, definitely Shiva is the god of the linga, the phallus. So there is a clear connection with this idea, generation of the male power to create life, but always in connection with the feminine element, of course. And also some scholars have mentioned in relation to both Shiva and Dionysus. So again, but again, Fiachra has already complicated this notion, the notion of the imposition of an alien cult upon established orthodoxy. That would work with Shiva, but again, with Dionysus, we have seen that matters are slightly more complicated than that. And also, well, Wendy Doniger mentions that both gods somehow produce a kind of conciliation of opposites, which is a bit of a hazy notion, I would argue. But certainly these are gods of paradoxes, maybe I would say, and the paradoxical nature of these gods. What is also interesting, something that I would like to mention, is that even if the standard connection that is made is nowadays, at least, between Dionysus and Shiva. Sir William Jones, who is known as the person who made popular the hypothesis, which then became a theory, about the common origin of Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit language towards the very, very end of the 18th century. So Sir William Jones, who at the time was in India in 1784, composed an essay titled On the Gods of Greece, Italy, and India. This essay was later revised, so probably when we read it now, we are looking at the revised version. But anyway, so as I said, we are towards the end of the 18th century, and William Jones is trying to establish parallels, so one-on-one parallels between the gods of the Greco-Roman pantheon and those of Hinduism. And what he observes with respect to Dionysus is that he could be compared to Rama, the god Rama. But rather, he's starting from Rama, obviously, and trying to find a counterpart in the Greco-Roman pantheon. So he's not mentioning Shiva, but instead a god, because Rama is, well, famously the character of the Hindu epic poem Ramayana, which is also a sacred text. Rama is a manifestation, an avatar of the god Vishnu, so not Shiva, but another god of the Hindu Trimurti. And Rama is a king, and is definitely a character who embodies a sense of justice, of civilization, and the ability of a god who's also a human to bring dharma, to bring righteousness and justice to the world of human beings. So in this sense, he has a civilizing influence on the world. And this is probably what intrigues William Jones. Interestingly, and with this I shall conclude, Sir William Jones compares the army of the monkeys that Rama led, because if you are familiar with the epic poem, the Ramayana, there is a moment in the poem when Rama is leading an army of monkeys. And clearly, what William Jones is doing is comparing this army of quasi-human, quasi-animal creatures, because these are kind of human-like monkeys. He's comparing this army with the army that is led by Dionysus as he marches towards and into India, which is composed of satyrs. So that's the kind of connection that William Jones makes, thinking of these two armies that include quite extraordinary creatures. He also goes into some more detailed comparison, or rather, William Jones mentions that he would like to draw more precise, more minute comparisons between precisely the epic poem by Nonnus and the Ramayana. So that's where he concludes. He's basically promising or hoping that he would find the time to do that, to compare these two epic poems, because he claims this would prove that Dionysus and Rama have been the same person. He didn't do that, and hopefully someone else will achieve this very noble goal.
Thank you. That was very rich and fascinating. I am aware of time, and I think we should get to our very last question, which I think you both kind of touched upon here and there, which is going back to the first question, who is Dionysus? And I think you've mentioned a series of features of Dionysus that might explain, but again, if you could go back to these features and highlight them for us, might explain the transportability and adaptability of Dionysus as a god. My very last question is why does Dionysus appear so transportable and so adaptable to other cultures and places? Or is that not the case, actually?
I mean, certainly Dionysus has a very enduring appeal in the Western tradition, as we know very well, and we talked about antiquity, but we could look through, the European tradition, and Maddalena has, just given an account of his presence, or rather analogies between Dionysus and Hindu gods that William James and others discerned. Looking forward to the possibility of a broad-based comparison between Nonnus's Dionysiaca and the Ramayana. I think it must be to do with Dionysus standing as a principle of life as distinct from death, divinity as distinct from mortality. There are various stories that say that Dionysus was originally mortal and was elevated to divinity, like Castor and Pollux, or like Romulus, or like Hercules. So tapping in, then, the idea of tapping into a sort of a longing for divinity, a longing for eternal life, a longing to cross the boundary between humanity and divinity. And the idea of god of fertility and god of nature, all cultures that have gods have nature gods. And Dionysus ticks that box very well. The fact that he's dangerous, I think, is also something that's quite attractive about him.
I would just add, well, it's not really an addition, just going back to what we have said about Dionysus as a god of dance, of ecstasy, and that works very well with Shiva, actually, not quite as much with Rama. That is really a very powerful, very potent aspect of his character and of his influence over human beings. And so again, I have to say that however much I enjoy reading William Jones' writings in every aspect of Sanskrit language and literature, I think that the comparison between Rama and Dionysus is a strange one. I very much prefer the parallel between Shiva and Dionysus, and I see these two as dancing gods, ecstatic gods, and that's probably their eternal fascination and power.